She's been freeloading off this family her entire life. First off her father, then off her husband, and now she has the nerve to sit at my table and pretend she belongs here. My mother-in-law's voice didn't rise. That was the thing about Irene that most people never understood. She didn't need to raise her voice. She'd spent decades perfecting the kind of delivery that could split a room clean open while maintaining the expression of a woman commenting on the weather. 200 guests at the Okanagan Valley Charity Gala, the annual fundraiser for the BC Children's Hospital Foundation, and every single one of them heard her. The room didn't gasp. It just went very still the way rooms do when someone says the thing everyone else was too polite to say out loud. She turned to the man standing beside her at the podium, Dr. Brennan Lowe, Chief of Cardiac Surgery at Vancouver General, the same surgeon whose research had just been featured on the front page of the Globe and Mail. She pressed one hand to his forearm. Now here, she announced to the table arrangements and the crystal glasses and the 200 people holding their dessert forks in mid-air, is the kind of person this family should be proud of. A man who builds things, who actually contributes. Not some woman who married into a good name and has been decorating herself with it ever since. My brother-in-law, Claude, smirked from the third table. My sister-in-law, Viviane, lifted her champagne with a small, tight smile. My husband sat beside me with his jaw set and his hands flat on the tablecloth, and I knew without looking that he was doing the thing he always did, which was calculating the exact cost of intervening versus the cost of staying silent. He had been making that calculation for 11 years. I sat very still. My right hand was below the table and my thumb had already found the side button on my phone and pressed it twice. Voice memo. Running. It was the same reflex I developed over a decade of depositions and cross-examinations, the understanding that anything said in a room can become evidence, and evidence has a way of mattering long after the moment that produced it has passed. Then I looked at Brennan Lowe. He wasn't smiling. He was looking at the lanyard around my neck, at the credentials card that the gala committee had printed for every registered speaker. He was looking at my name and below my name, the title that the committee had pulled directly from the Law Society of British Columbia's public registry. Partner, Litigation, Thornfield and Associates. He was reading the smaller line underneath. Pro Bono Counsel, BC Immigrant Legal Defense Network, 6 consecutive years. His expression didn't shift gradually. Something behind his eyes cracked open, fast, the way a window cracks before it breaks. He took a single step back and in a voice that was quieter than I expected, but carried exactly as far as it needed to carry, he said, "You're the Dunmore Lawyer. The woman at table 4, the one who ran the legal aid clinic out of Surrey and had driven 2 hours in November rain to be here, set down her water glass. The sound it made on the tablecloth was very small and very loud at the same time. Irene's smile didn't die. It suspended, like a program that had stopped receiving input. But before I tell you what happened when Brennan Lowe said those 3 words and why they unraveled 30 years of my mother-in-law's carefully constructed story in the time it takes to pour a glass of wine, stay with me. Because what Irene did not know, what she had never bothered to learn about the woman she'd been erasing from family photographs and dinner conversations for over a decade, was the thing that was about to make the next 10 minutes of her life extremely uncomfortable. Irene Ashford had been building her version of me since the night my husband first brought me home to the house in West Vancouver, that enormous pale stone thing sitting above the water with the kind of view that people work their whole lives for. I was 26. I was wearing the only blazer I owned, which I had borrowed from my roommate because mine had a coffee stain on the lapel I couldn't get out. My father was a retired postal worker from Hamilton. My mother had emigrated from the Philippines when she was 19 and had spent next to 30 years working hospital laundry shifts and sending money home to her sisters and never once complaining about either of those facts. Irene knew all of this before I walked through the door. My husband had told her. He told me later that she'd said, "Well, she sounds very determined," in the tone a person uses when determined is not a compliment. The first dinner was a kind of audition I didn't know I was failing. Irene asked me questions across the roast chicken and the good wine and the monogrammed napkins, and every question was shaped like a compliment but functioned as a trap. "Your family must be so proud you're in law school. It's such an achievement for someone from your background." For someone from your background. I was 26 and hungry and I let it pass. I imagine tuition must have been quite a stretch. It's wonderful that there are bursary programs. I had a full academic scholarship. I didn't say so. Of course, legal aid is important work. Not everyone can do the high-stakes cases. You have to know your limits. I ate my dessert. I said thank you for dinner. I drove home on the Trans-Canada with my roommate's blazer, folded on the passenger seat, and I thought about what my mother had told me the night before I left Hamilton for Vancouver. She'd sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd helped me with every university application, and read every draft of every personal statement, and she'd said, "Marisol, The people who will try to make you feel small are afraid of exactly the things you're capable of. Remember that. I had remembered it every single time I sat at Irene's table for 11 years. My father-in-law, Douglas, was a quieter man. He had built the family's real estate development company from 2 properties in Burnaby into one of the larger, privately held portfolios in the Lower Mainland, and he'd done it the way people do things when they don't need to announce them, by showing up and doing the work, and not making speeches about it. He was polite to me in a way that was different from Irene's politeness. His was genuine. I noticed early that when Douglas asked how my week had been, he waited for the actual answer. It was Douglas who had called me the first time I won a case that made the news. A refugee family from Eritrea, a deportation order that should never have been issued. A hearing where the other side's counsel spent 40 minutes trying to argue that a family who had survived what that family had survived was somehow not credible. I had spent 6 months on that file. I had worked it on top of my regular caseload, early mornings and Sunday evenings, because the family had no money and no other options, and the little girl was the same age my daughter would be, if I had a daughter, which I thought about more than I mentioned to anyone. We won. The order was overturned. The story ran in the Vancouver Sun, and CBC British Columbia picked it up the same afternoon. Douglas had called that evening. "I saw the news," he said. "I wanted to call and say I'm proud of you. Irene doesn't know I'm calling." A pause. She wouldn't understand why I felt I had to. I had sat in my car in the parking garage under our building and held the phone against my chest for a full minute after we hung up. That was the only compliment I ever received from that family that cost someone something to give. The case that changed everything had started as a phone call from a duty council colleague at 3 in the morning. 47 people. Detained at the processing center in Abbotsford. The warrant had procedural errors that were significant enough to challenge, but narrow enough that a less experienced litigator might have missed them. The government's counsel was one of the best in the country. The media hadn't picked it up yet, but it was going to be the kind of case that moved slowly through the system until it suddenly, all at once, moved very fast. I took it. I did not take it because it was going to be good for my career, though my senior partner later told me it was. I took it because 47 people were sitting in a facility in Abbotsford, and the procedural error in their warrant was something I could see clearly, and I was one of the people qualified to do something about it. The next 8 months were the kind of months you don't describe to people who weren't there, because the description always sounds like an exaggeration. I billed my regular hours at the firm. I worked the Abbotsford case in the spaces around them. My husband brought dinner to the office twice a week and ate it with me at my desk without complaining about it. Our anniversary came and went, and I acknowledged it on the day of and made it up to him the following weekend. And he was gracious about both of those things in a way I am still grateful for. The case went to the Federal Court of Canada. The government's counsel was very good. I was slightly better, or perhaps more precisely, I had spent more time with the specific procedural question at the heart of the case, which meant that when the moment came where the argument turned on a narrow technical point about the timing of the warrant application, I was the only person in the room who had anticipated exactly how that turn would happen and prepared for it. The decision came down on a Thursday. All 47 people were released. The procedural error was confirmed, and the warrant was ruled invalid. The decision cited my submissions directly in 2 places, which does not happen often, and which my senior partner pointed out twice over lunch. What the decision also did, though this only became apparent over the following weeks, was establish a precedent that changed how similar warrants would be reviewed going forward. The immigration bar called it the Dunmore Standard, after the facility where the original warrant had been processed. I had not chosen the name and in fact found it slightly uncomfortable, but it had taken hold the way these things do, and there wasn't much to be done about it. Irene did not call. My husband told her. He showed her the article in the Globe and Mail. He explained what a federal court precedent meant in practical terms. She listened and then said, "Well, I suppose that's what law school was for," and changed the subject to Claude's new kitchen renovation, which was apparently coming in under budget. I heard about this secondhand from my husband, who told me in the apologetic tone he reserved for his mother's most specific varieties of dismissal. I had, by that point, stopped expecting anything different. The charity gala had not been my idea. Douglas had been diagnosed with a progressive heart condition the previous spring, the kind that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but settles in and changes the arithmetic of a person's days quietly and permanently. He had been a donor to the BC Children's Hospital Foundation for 20 years. The gala was important to him. He had asked, specifically, whether my husband and I would attend, and my husband had said yes before asking me, and I had said yes when he asked me because Douglas had called me from the hospital waiting room the day he got his diagnosis, and I had been the first person he'd called. Irene had organized the seating in a way that placed me on the outer edge of the family table, between my husband and a woman I didn't know, with Irene and Claude and Vivienne and their respective partners arranged in a cluster at the center of the table closest to the podium. The same geometry she'd been maintaining for 11 years, slightly adjusted for the size and shape of the venue. I had come to know these adjustments well. At Christmas, I was positioned at the far end of the living room where the good photographs didn't reach. At family dinners, I was served last and asked questions last, and when conversations turned to the family's various accomplishments, my name appeared nowhere in the inventory. Though I had in the previous 3 years been made partner at one of the most respected litigation firms in Vancouver, had argued a case before the federal court, and had been named to the Law Society's pro bono honor roll for the 4th year running. When I walked in that night, I had already done the thing I always did at events I knew would be difficult, which was to locate the exits, identify the people I actually wanted to speak with, and find one quiet thing to hold on to. The quiet thing that night was the card in my lanyard. Just my name and my title, and the credentials the Law Society's public registry had assigned to me based on 17 years of work. Nothing on that card had been given to me. Every word of it I had earned on my own. Brennan Lowe had recognized it. That was the thing Irene hadn't calculated. When she'd arranged for Brennan to be the gala's keynote speaker, when she'd leveraged her board connections to have him seated at her table and positioned him at her side for the remarks, she had been assembling what she believed was an unassailable argument. Look at this. This is excellence. The other thing, the woman in the borrowed blazer, the postal worker's daughter, the girl from Hamilton, is not this. She had not done the elementary research of finding out whether Brennan Lowe knew who I was. He did. Because 8 months earlier, Brennan Lowe had spent 14 hours in surgery trying to repair the heart of a 31-year-old man from one of the Abbotsford 47, a man who had been held in the facility for 9 weeks before the Dunmore decision, and who had arrived at Vancouver General 3 months after his release with a cardiac event that Brennan later told a colleague was directly stress-correlated in his clinical opinion, and who had survived that surgery because Brennan Lowe was exactly as good at his job as his CV suggested he was. He had read about the Dunmore case because that patient had shown him the decision from his hospital bed. He had gone home that night and read the full federal court ruling and my submissions and the secondary coverage in the legal press. He had told a colleague the following week that the brief was the best procedural argument he'd read in years, which was a thing he would not normally say because he did not read many legal briefs, but he had read this one. And he had been standing at a podium in a gala ballroom in Kelowna being introduced as the son this family should have been given when he looked down and saw the lanyard card of the Dunmore Lawyer. "You're the Dunmore Lawyer," he said. And the woman at table 4 with the legal aid clinic in Surrey set down her water glass, and Irene's smile suspended. And then Brennan Lowe did what I had not expected him to do and what Irene could not have predicted in any version of her planning, which was to step away from the podium entirely. He moved one step to his left, out of the spotlight, and turned to face the room the way you turn when you want what you're about to say to go somewhere and not just hang in the air. He said, "I have a patient. I'm not going to use his name, because that's not mine to do. But I want to tell you about a 31-year-old man who spent 9 weeks in a detention facility for procedural reasons that should never have resulted in his detention, and who came to me 3 months after he was released with a heart that had been under sustained, severe stress for a duration that a healthy 31-year-old heart should never have to survive. I operated on him for 14 hours. He made it. He is doing well." He paused. "The reason he was released, the reason any of those 47 people were released, is the woman sitting at this table who apparently just got called a freeloader." Claude's champagne glass stopped moving. Vivienne put her phone face down on the tablecloth. Douglas, from the seat at the end of the table where Irene had positioned him because his mobility had been reduced by the medication, and she'd said it would be easier for him, straightened in his chair. His jaw was set. His eyes were fixed on his wife with an expression I had never seen on his face in 11 years and did not want to read too closely because reading it would make what was happening in my chest harder to manage. Brennan wasn't finished. "I don't know the internal dynamics of this family," he said, in the flat factual register of someone delivering a clinical assessment. "That's not my business. What is my business is accuracy. And with all due respect, the accurate version of the contribution that woman has made is not something that fits on a credential card. What I can tell you is that the work she did resulted in a legal standard that will protect people who have no other protection for years after tonight. You cannot put a number on that. I have tried, professionally, from a healthcare cost perspective alone, and I cannot." He picked up his water glass, took a measured sip, and sat down. The room was the kind of quiet that presses. Irene opened her mouth. She said, "Well, Brennan, that's all very admirable, but Marisol has always had a gift for finding sympathetic cases. It's a certain kind of talent. It's just not the same as." She did not finish the sentence. She did not finish it because Douglas had put both hands on the table and stood up. Douglas, who had not stood up quickly in 4 months. Douglas, who had been placed at the end of the table because his wife had said it would be easier for him. He stood up and he looked at her and he said nothing for a long moment, just looked. And then he turned to the room. "My daughter-in-law," he said, in the deliberate voice of a man who has been doing the math on something for a long time and has finally finished the calculation, has been part of this family for 11 years. She has never once asked us for anything and has never once received from us what she deserved. I would like to correct the record. The woman from the legal aid clinic in Surrey was the first one on her feet. Then a man from the far table who I later learned was with the Immigration Bar Association. Then the woman who ran the refugee settlement house in Abbotsford and had driven here because Douglas had personally asked her to attend and had covered the cost of her ticket without telling Irene. Then 3 more. Then the slow, unstoppable wave of it, the people in that room who knew what the Dunmore case had meant, who had read the decision or worked in its aftermath, or had someone in their lives whose life had been touched by the 47 people from that facility. No applause, just standing. The specific silence of people who have decided something together without speaking. Irene sat down. I looked at my hands. There is a callus on my right index finger from the way I hold a pen when I'm annotating case files, a small hard ridge that has been there since 2nd year of law school. My hands have never looked like the hands of someone who belongs in a room like this one, with the crystal and the tablecloths and the view across the valley. They look like my mother's hands. They look like the hands of a woman who works. I stood up. I walked to the podium. I did not take the microphone. I didn't need it. I looked at Irene and I said, I did not marry into this family to borrow its name. I came with my own, and everything I've built has been built with my own hands, in my own name, for reasons that have nothing to do with this table or your opinion of what I'm worth. I paused. I won't be spoken about that way again. Not here, not anywhere. That's not a request. I walked back through the standing people and sat down beside my husband. He took my hand under the table and held it. He did not say anything. He had spent 11 years finding the cost of speaking, and tonight his father had done it for him, and the calculation had finally resolved. I felt the resolution in the way he held my hand, like something that had been closed tight for a very long time was slowly, carefully beginning to open. We drove home on the Coquihalla in the dark, the mountains either side of the highway showing only as absences of stars. My husband drove. I watched the dark shapes of the mountains and thought about my mother in her kitchen in Hamilton, up at 6 tomorrow morning, regardless of what was happening in ballrooms in the Okanagan, making tea the way she always made it, the way she'd made it every morning of my entire childhood. She would not know what had happened tonight until I called her. And when I called her, she would listen to the whole thing without interrupting, which was a skill she had that almost no one else possessed, and then she would say, Anak, I always knew. I just waited for everyone else to figure it out. I had not cried at the gala. I cried a little on the Coquihalla, with the mountains on both sides, and my husband's hand on the gear shift, and the kind of tiredness that comes not from doing too much, but from finally being allowed to stop bracing for something. Irene was in the kitchen when we got home, because she and Douglas had staying at the house we'd bought 2 years earlier when his mobility had started to change, at his request, and with my agreement, because the house had a main floor bedroom and theirs didn't. She was standing at the counter with both hands around a mug of something that was clearly not her first mug of the evening. She didn't turn around when we came in. I sat down at the kitchen table. My husband went upstairs without a word, not from cowardice, but because he understood, I think, that this was a conversation that needed to have only 2 people in it. I waited. In litigation, there is a technique called constructive silence. You ask your question and then you stop talking, and you let the space fill with whatever the other person has been holding. It is more effective than follow-up questions in almost every context, because people cannot tolerate a void, they fill it with truth. I had been practicing constructive silence for 17 years. I counted Irene's breathing, shallow, slightly fast. The breathing of someone assembling a response and finding the materials insufficient. She turned around. She was 68 years old, and she was wearing the expression of a woman who had run a room for 40 years and had, for the first time in her life, found the room no longer responding. She said, I don't know how to talk to you. I never have. You came into this family with everything already decided about yourself, and there was no room for me. This was not an apology. I recognized it immediately for what it was, which was a reframe. She had taken 30 years of deliberate, systematic dismissal and reclassified it as a communication problem. My fault as much as hers, or more. The kind of thing that sounds almost like honesty until you hold it up to the light. I looked at her for a long moment. You never tried to find a room, I said. You decided what I was on the night I walked through your door in a borrowed blazer, and you have been deciding ever since. I have done nothing in 11 years to justify what you said tonight. Not one thing, and we both know it. She set the mug down. Douglas, she started. Douglas told the truth, I said. That's between the two of you. She sat down across from me. The kitchen was very quiet. The clock above the stove said 12:47. Through the window, the lower mainland spread out below us in its nighttime grid of lights, all those lit windows, all those people living their lives without knowing that anything had happened or changed this evening. I wanted Claude to be more, she said finally. Her voice had changed register. Something underneath it had given way. And he isn't. And you are. And I have spent a very long time not being able to look at that without it costing me something. I was not prepared for that one. I sat with it. That's not my fault, I said. No, she said, it isn't. That was as close to an apology as Irene Ashford had ever come in her life. I could see the effort it cost her. It landed on the table between us and lay there, and I looked at it and I thought about the dinner in West Vancouver with the borrowed blazer. I thought about the Christmas photographs. I thought about Douglas calling me from the hospital waiting room and saying, I'm proud of you before calling anyone else. I thought about the 31-year-old man in Brennan Lowe's operating room, his heart under pressure from 9 weeks in a facility that should never have held him, and the 14 hours it took to repair the damage. The acknowledgement she was offering me now was real. It was also 20 years too late, and approximately half of what the situation required. The two things were both true simultaneously. I had learned to hold contradictions like that from reading federal court decisions, which are full of them. I'm going to go to bed, I said. Douglas needs someone steady in the morning. I'll be here. I stood up. I pushed the chair back in. Marisol, she said. I stopped. She looked at me with the expression of a woman learning, very late, the cost of a thing she'd been spending for decades, without keeping track of the receipts. The work you do, she said. I looked it up. After the Globe and Mail piece, I read the decision. She stopped. Started again. It's remarkable. What you've built is remarkable. The words arrived correct and too late, and I received them the way you receive something in that condition, with recognition but without the feeling that was supposed to come attached. The need for her to say it had finished the work of becoming something else a long time ago, somewhere between a duty council call at 3 in the morning and a 31-year-old man with a repaired heart going home to his family. Good night, I said. I did not slam the door. There was no door to slam. I walked through the kitchen arch and up the stairs, and my husband was awake with the lamp on, and he looked at me when I came in, and I sat on the edge of the bed and he put his arm around me, and we sat like that for a while without saying anything. 6 weeks later, I drove to Hamilton. Not for the gala, not for a case, not for any obligation. I drove because my mother had been in the same house for 34 years, and I had not sat at her kitchen table without an agenda in longer than I could specifically account for. She made tea. She put out the small cookies she kept in the blue tin. She sat across from me and waited, because she had always known that I would get to the thing I needed to say eventually, if she gave me enough quiet to find it. I told her about the gala. I told her about Brennan Lowe and the Dunmore case, and the standing people and Douglas at the end of the table, with his hands flat on the cloth and his jaw set. I told her about Irene in the kitchen, and the words that arrived too late. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at me across the table, the same table where she'd read every draft of every personal statement, the table where she'd done the math on every bursary application and every scholarship form, with her reading glasses on and her pen moving carefully. Anak, she said, I always knew. Some people take longer to see what is in front of them. It is not your job to wait for them. I thought about the Dunmore case, about the brief that had taken 8 months and 3 continents of legal precedent to construct, about the moment in the federal court when the argument turned on, the narrow technical question, and I had been the only person in the room who had anticipated exactly where that turn would happen. I thought about 47 people going home. I know, I said. She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers, my mother's hand, small and warm and calloused in its own way, the marks of a different kind of work in a different kind of room, but the same essential fact underneath, the fact of someone who had showed up every day and done what needed to be done and had not required anyone's permission to do it. We sat there in the kitchen in Hamilton with the tea and the blue tin of cookies and the clock on the wall that had kept the same imperfect time for as long as I could remember. Outside, someone was shoveling the sidewalk, the rhythmic scrape of a shovel on concrete, the specific sound of a Canadian November morning, where the work is ordinary and necessary and nobody is watching. I was not waiting for anything. For the first time in 11 years, I was not bracing for the next revision of myself that someone else required. The only thing ahead of me was the drive back to Vancouver, the office, the files on my desk, the next case that needed someone who could see where the argument turned before anyone else did. I was Marisol Tran de la Crai. My name was on the federal court record. My mother had made the tea the same way for 34 years, and I had learned everything that mattered at this table. Nobody needed to give me permission for any of that. They never had.